I found out I wasn't officially listed as a co-founder of the company I had spent 20 years building in any of our formal corporate documents, letterhead, or public-facing materials. On the same afternoon, a Forbes reporter called asking to interview me specifically about my unique perspective building the company from the ground floor. I sat at my desk, holding my phone, staring at our official company letterhead pinned to the wall beside me, a document listing exactly one founder's name, my father's, and realized, for the first time with full, undeniable clarity, exactly how completely he had erased my role across 2 decades of building, something I had genuinely helped create. Part 1. The company we built together. My name is Diane Chen, and the company in question, Meridian Structural Engineering, was founded in 2004 by my father, Wei Chen, and in every practical sense I understood at the time, by me as well, though my name, as I would eventually discover, had never appeared on the company's formal founding documents in any capacity beyond an early, minor equity stake buried in paperwork I hadn't examined closely in years. I was 24 years old in 2004, having just completed my master's degree in structural engineering, when my father approached me with the idea of starting a specialized engineering firm together, focused initially on seismic retrofitting for older commercial buildings across the Pacific Northwest. A genuinely promising niche, given the region's specific structural challenges, and one my father, with over 2 decades of engineering experience by that point, had identified through his own professional expertise. I want to be direct about the actual substance of my contribution across the following 2 decades, because understanding the genuine depth of my involvement matters enormously to understanding the weight of what I eventually discovered about my formal exclusion from the company's founding documentation. I developed, in those early years, several of the specific structural analysis methodologies that became core to Meridian's competitive advantage in the seismic retrofitting space. I built and managed, for over a decade, the company's entire client relationship and business development function, personally securing several of our largest, most significant contracts across those years. I eventually took over primary technical leadership of our engineering team as the company grew from its original 2-person operation to, by 2024, a firm employing over 60 engineers and support staff across 3 regional offices. Part 2. Understanding my actual formal position. I want to explain how I came to discover, after 20 years, that my substantial, genuine contributions to Meridian's founding and growth had never been formally reflected in the company's public-facing identity, because the specific mechanism of this discovery matters for understanding both my father's reasoning and my own gradual, accumulating understanding of what had actually happened. I had always understood myself, informally, as a co-founder of Meridian, a characterization my father had used himself in private family conversations and even, occasionally, in internal company communications across most of those 20 years. What I had not fully examined, until the specific events of this story, was the actual formal corporate documentation, letterhead, website biography, and external marketing materials, all of which I would discover consistently listed my father as Meridian's sole founder, with my own role described, when mentioned at all in various secondary terms, chief engineer, partner, senior leadership, but never in any external-facing document across 2 decades as co-founder. Part 3. The Forbes Call. The specific event that finally exposed this discrepancy occurred in March 2024, when I received a call from a Forbes reporter named Jonathan Reyes, working on a feature story about specialized engineering firms successfully navigating the increasingly significant seismic retrofit market across the West Coast. "I've been researching Meridian's work extensively," Jonathan told me during that initial call, "and I keep encountering your name specifically across multiple technical papers, industry conference presentations, and client testimonials, describing you as the driving force behind several of the company's most innovative retrofitting methodologies. I'd like to build this feature specifically around your individual perspective and expertise, rather than a more general company profile." I felt a genuine, complicated swell of pride at this framing, External, considerable professional validation for work I had always understood as genuinely significant, even as that same work had never been formally reflected in Meridian's own internal or external documentation. I mentioned this upcoming Forbes feature to my father that same afternoon, expecting, naively in retrospect, a straightforwardly positive reaction to this significant professional recognition for our company. Part 4. My father's reaction. My father's response to the Forbes feature news carried an unexpected, immediate undercurrent of discomfort that I initially struggled to fully understand. "That's wonderful, Diane," he said, though his tone carried less enthusiasm than I'd anticipated. "Just be careful how you characterize the company's founding story in the interview. Investors and clients respond to a clear, singular founder narrative. We should probably discuss talking points before you speak with him." This comment prompted me, for the first time in 20 years, to actually pull our company's formal founding documents and external marketing materials, wanting to understand exactly what founding story my father was specifically concerned about me potentially contradicting. What I found, reviewing these materials carefully for the first time in years, produced the specific, disorienting realization that gives this story its title. Across every formal document, every piece of external marketing material, every version of our company websites, about page across 2 decades, I was listed at best as an early employee or senior partner. Never once in any external-facing document as a co-founder, despite having been present from the company's actual first day of operation, having contributed founding-level intellectual property and business development effort, and having held, per our internal, informal understanding, genuine equity reflecting founding-level contribution. Part 5. The confrontation. I confronted my father directly the following day, bringing printed copies of our company's various external materials to a meeting I specifically requested, wanting to understand, clearly and directly, the actual reasoning behind 2 decades of formal exclusion from our founding narrative. "Dad," I said, "I need you to explain this to me clearly. I've been listed as an early employee, a senior partner, a chief engineer, every possible title except the one that actually reflects my genuine involvement in starting this company. Why has my name never appeared as co-founder in any of our external materials?" My father's explanation, delivered with what I could tell was genuine discomfort, but not, initially, full acknowledgement of the harm involved, centered on a specific, long-standing business philosophy he'd apparently maintained across the entire 20 years of Meridian's operation. "When we started this company," he said, "I made a deliberate decision about how to present our founding story externally. I believed, based on considerable observation of how investors, major clients, and industry partners respond to founding narratives, that a clear, singular founder story, built around my own established engineering reputation at the time, would generate more confidence and easier trust than a more complicated, dual-founder narrative, particularly given that you were, at the time we started, a 24-year-old fresh out of graduate school without an established reputation of your own yet." He paused and continued with the specific phrase that would eventually give this story its title. "Investors prefer a founder's story, not a founder's daughter, Diane. I believed, and I still believe there was some genuine truth to this at the time, that presenting you primarily as my daughter and junior partner, rather than as an equal co-founder, made our early fundraising and business development considerably easier than a more complicated narrative would have." Part 6. What this explanation actually revealed. I want to be honest about the specific, layered difficulty of processing this explanation, because it complicated, considerably, my initial assumption that my exclusion reflected simple, uncomplicated dismissal of my actual contributions. "I understand," I told my father, "that this might have reflected genuine, if flawed, business strategy in our very first years, when we were genuinely unknown and needed to build initial credibility quickly. But Dad, this pattern continued for 20 years. I built entire methodologies this company is now known for. I've personally secured contracts worth tens of millions of dollars across our client relationships. I've led our engineering team through some of our most technically challenging projects. At what point did the actual, accumulated reality of my contributions stop, mattering less than whatever narrative convenience you believed a clean founder story provided? My father sat with this question for a long moment before responding, and his eventual answer carried a vulnerability I hadn't previously witnessed from him across our 2 decades of working together. "I think," he said, "what started as a genuine, if flawed, strategic decision in our earliest years became, over time, simply the established pattern I never revisited or questioned, even as the original justification for it became increasingly outdated. I think, if I'm honest with myself, some part of me also never fully adjusted my own internal understanding of you from my daughter joining my company to my genuine equal partner in building this company, even as your actual role and contribution clearly outgrew that original framing years ago." Part 7, the Forbes interview. I proceeded with the Forbes interview roughly 2 weeks after this difficult conversation with my father, having made a deliberate, considered decision about how to handle the specific question of Meridian's founding narrative, given everything I'd learned about the company's actual formal documentation. When Jonathan Reyes asked, directly, about the company's founding story during our interview, I answered with full, unambiguous honesty. "I co-founded Meridian Structural Engineering alongside my father in 2004, I told him. "I've been part of this company from its actual first day of operation, and I've spent 20 years building the specific technical methodologies and client relationships that have made our seismic retrofitting practice genuinely distinctive within our industry. I want to be honest that our company's external marketing materials haven't always fully reflected this founding partnership accurately, a discrepancy I've only recently examined closely myself, and one I'm actively working to correct." This honest acknowledgement became, notably, a significant part of the eventual published Forbes feature, which Jonathan ultimately framed not simply as a profile of my individual technical expertise, but as a broader examination of how founding narratives in family businesses often obscure genuine, substantial contributions from family members whose roles get informally minimized relative to a more marketable, simplified single-founder story, a framing that resonated once published, with a considerable number of readers who reached out afterward, describing similar dynamics within their own family businesses. Part 8, the aftermath within Meridian. The Forbes features publication in May 2024 prompted, within Meridian itself, a genuinely significant internal reckoning that extended considerably beyond my individual relationship with my father. Several of our senior engineering staff, upon reading the published feature, approached me directly to express their own recognition of my genuine founding-level contribution to the company, validation that, while genuinely appreciated, also highlighted, somewhat painfully, how thoroughly the company's internal culture had absorbed and normalized a founding narrative that didn't actually reflect my true role, even among colleagues who had worked alongside me for years and presumably understood, informally, the genuine depth of my contribution. My father, in the weeks following the feature's publication, initiated a formal process to correct Meridian's official corporate documentation, updating our website, our formal letterhead, our investor materials, and our public marketing content to accurately reflect my status as co-founder, a correction that involved, among other practical steps, formally amending our original incorporation documents to reflect what had always been true in practice, but had never been accurately documented across 2 decades of the company's operation. Part 9, what my father said afterward. I want to include a specific, meaningful conversation my father and I had several months after the Forbes features publication, once the immediate formal corrections had been completed, because it represented, I believe, the fullest acknowledgement he offered throughout this entire process. "I've been thinking considerably," he told me, during a quiet dinner conversation that August, "about what it actually means that it took a national magazine calling to profile you specifically before I finally, formally corrected 20 years of inaccurate founding documentation. I should have made this correction myself, years ago, simply because it was the honest, accurate reflection of what you'd actually built alongside me, not because external validation finally made the discrepancy impossible to continue ignoring. I appreciate you saying that, I told him. I need you to understand that this isn't really about the specific words on a letterhead, Dad. It's about 20 years of a pattern where my genuine contribution got quietly minimized in favor of a simpler, more convenient story. A pattern I only fully saw clearly once something external forced both of us to actually look at it directly. Part 10. Building a more accurate partnership going forward. I want to be honest about the specific, ongoing work my father, and I have continued since this reckoning. Rather than suggesting a single dramatic correction, fully resolved 20 years of accumulated pattern. We renegotiated, over the following months, a formal, updated partnership agreement that reflected, with full accuracy, both my founding-level contribution to Meridian's original establishment and my current, substantial leadership role within the company's ongoing operations. A legal and financial correction that went considerably beyond the earlier, more symbolic correction of our public marketing materials. We also began, deliberately, incorporating more accurate co-founder framing into our ongoing external communications, client relationships, and industry presence. A practice my father, notably, has maintained consistently in the time since, actively correcting industry colleagues and clients who continue to reference him as Meridian's sole founder based on years of previously established, inaccurate narrative. Epilogue. It has been just over a year since that Forbes reporter's initial call, and Meridian structural engineering now accurately, consistently reflects both my father's and my own genuine, founding-level contribution across every formal and informal representation of our company's history and ongoing operation. I think often about the specific, uncomfortable irony of how this correction finally arrived, not through my own direct confrontation of the pattern, which I had, admittedly, never fully examined closely enough myself across 20 years to actually challenge directly, but through an external journalist's genuine, independent recognition of my professional contribution. A recognition significant enough that it finally made continuing to ignore the discrepancy impossible for my father to sustain. I don't know if my father would have ever initiated this correction on his own, absent that specific external prompt, and I've made my own peace with not fully knowing the answer to that particular question. What matters considerably more to me now is that Meridian's actual, ongoing story finally, accurately reflects what was always true in practice, that I didn't simply join my father's company as a junior partner 20 years ago. I helped build it from its very first day as his genuine, equal co-founder, a truth that took 2 decades and an outside journalist's phone call to finally, formally become the story Meridian tells about itself. At the end,